Let's get started with the recent attack of Ukrainians on Russian in Sebastopol. They were attacking civilians, and they have used ATACMS from the United States using cluster bombs. Could you elaborate on the details of this attack and then talk about why would Ukraine need such an attack on civilians, and without the United States and Europeans providing intelligence to Ukrainians, was that possible for them to do that?
Well, yes. I mean, there are many questions in your question. And the first one is probably the easiest one, is to have a picture of what happened. Apparently, 5 ATACMS missiles were shot at the area surrounding Sebastopol. And in fact, we see that those 5 missile targets targeted 3 areas which are basically on the coast. There's a huge bay in Sebastopol, which is used, especially in summertime, by the locals just to go for swimming and so. And those 5 missiles were targeting 3 areas, 3 beaches, in fact. Now, these missiles were in fact intercepted by Russian anti-missile defenses, but one of the missiles was destroyed in the air, but released bomblets. Now, these ATACMS missiles that were provided by the US already 1 year ago, in fact, they were equipped with those bomblets. Bomblets are basically used. I mean, they were developed in the 80s in the West for tactical missiles, but also artillery ammunition, in order to be able to break a possible, or what was considered as possible, a Soviet attack. And that was, in fact, the project was under the name of Assault Breaker. The idea is that when you are taken by surprise and with the enemy attack, you may not have all the capabilities in order to target very precisely your enemy. And you would then use those bomblets to have kind of an area effect on your enemy. And so you don't need to have very precise targeting. You can just bomb an area and that will destroy. I mean, some of the bomblets, I mean, they're mixed type of bomblets. Some might be anti-armor, and they have what we call a shape charge. A shape charge is an explosive charge that concentrates the explosions on one point, and that allows to pierce and to go through armor. And these are very small charges, but they're powerful enough to break the upper armor of tanks and armored vehicles, because usually tanks have the lightest armor on the top. The harder and strongest armor is on the side and on the front, for obvious reasons. And on the top, usually at top and rear, you have the thinnest armor. And this can be then pierced by those bomblets falling from above. And these charges can be combined with fragmentation, a fragmentation body, meaning that they can act, as I said, to pierce armor, but they can also explode radially and disperse fragments radially, and thus have an anti-infantry effect. So these bomblets were provided to Ukraine in last year, in 2023, with the idea that it would help. I mean, they were designed to break a Russian assault, but in fact, since the Americans had no longer any other ammunition, they provided this to support the counteroffensive of the Ukrainian counteroffensive last summer. This is not designed, these weapons are not designed for an attacking force, but are designed for a defending force. But okay, that's the way it is, and that's what the Ukrainians have. But the point is that these bomblets have an anti-personnel effect. And when the Ukrainians on last it was on Sunday, I think, don't remember what that was exactly, or yesterday it was, I mean, Sunday or yesterday.
Yeah.
Well, when they targeted those beaches, they definitely targeted infantry, because this type of ammunition is precisely to target infantry. So, and here the first question is that how come a country can deliberately target civilians who are, in that case, enjoying the sun on beaches? So we have here a clear demonstration that of something that I have demonstrated and also discussed in my last book, that the Ukrainian leadership tends to concentrate on soft targets and civilian targets because they are not able, probably they don't have the target acquisition systems and not the power, they are not powerful enough to attack the I mean, they do to some extent attack the Russian forces, but they expect to have more political leverage by attacking civilians. And that's the reason why Ukrainians, because what we have seen on these in the Sebastopol area is in fact a replication of something we have already seen in Belgorod and all that, because these attacks in Belgorod area that we have already discussed, these attacks targeted on also civilians. So what's the purpose of attacking civilians? And here, in reality, if you analyze the process, it's a similar process as the terrorist attack. The terrorist attack, or this kind of attack that targets civilians, in fact, use the civilians as a way to create a leverage towards the political authorities of the country. It's a mean to, there are two ways of actions here. And what I'm saying is not something that I have invented or found out myself. I based, and I was, in fact, when I wrote my book on countering jihadi terrorism, I came across a lot of writings by the Al-Qaeda in Yemen and the Islamic State. And they described the process very precisely and very bluntly, in fact. The idea is the following, is that since you cannot put enough pressure on a government, then you attack the population with the idea that the population would then attack their own government and say that you are not you are not protecting us enough, or you should not engage in that conflict, or you should withdraw from that conflict and all that. From an Islamic State perspective, the idea was to push in that case, the European, I mean, French or Belgian population, to press the Belgian or French authorities to withdraw their troops from Syria and Iraq. And here we have exactly the same kind of approach. And by the way, that was also described, and that's very interesting, and I mentioned that in my books. That was described by Ukrainians themselves. The idea is to put pressure on the Russian population so that they put pressure on the Russian government to stop the war. So we are exactly in the same kind of mechanism that I have described in my various books on asymmetric warfare, because this is exactly the way it works. You attack the population, and you hope that the population would then, in fact, turn against their own government. So it's a kind of indirect warfare. And by the way, this is exactly the same thing that the Israelis are doing when they bomb the Palestinian population in Gaza. And again, they explain that also very bluntly. Again, it's not my invention. The idea is that they bomb the civilian population, hoping that then the Palestinians would turn against Hamas. This is the idea. So we are talking about it's technically it's terrorism. Technically, it's terrorism. Then the word terrorism, it becomes a political designation, if you want, and it's politically motivated whether you decide to use that word or not. But technically speaking, this is terrorism. This is the way terrorism works. It's a way to put pressure on a government by using its population. And and that's exactly what the Ukrainians are doing. You know, the Ukrainians are not able to repel the Russian forces. I mean, they are not able to repel the Russian forces in the Donbass area in the south of the country, but they are not even able to push back the Russians in the Kharkov area. And therefore, it's tempting for them to attack the civilian population in order to create a pressure. By the way, we had this discussion already when we were talking about the attack on the Crocus center in Moscow, or near Moscow. This is exactly the same principle. This is exactly the same principle. So what we are witnessing is in effect a terrorist attack using instead of using guys with a bomb belt with bombs, you just use an attackers. That's the only difference. The way you bring the bomb to the population is the only difference, but technically it's. Now, that raised, of course, the question of how the US understands that, because as the US provided the first batch of attackers last year, they informed, and they were adamant that the Ukrainians guaranteed the Americans that they would not use those ATACMS against the civilian population. And that was explicitly said by the US as they were asked whether Ukraine might use these weapons against civilians. So the question and the possibility that the Ukrainian would use these missiles in that the kind of situation that was already raised almost 1 year ago. And apparently the Ukrainian government gave all the guarantees to the US that they would not do it, but they did it. And here this is absolutely clear because there is no military objective in the area. By the way, it's the same thing in Belgorod. Belgorod, the places that were attacked had no military objectives. So this is purely against civilians. So that raised the question of the morality of the Ukrainian establishment. That's one thing, but it also raised the question.
I have a little question here. Do you think if the United States didn't want them to attack Russia with ATACMS and with cluster bombs, how, and And at the same time, you're hearing that they're talking about that Ukrainians can attack Russia inside Russia. And how would they attack Russia without ATACMS, without cluster bombs?
Well, that's a good question, but you may assume, and I think even the Russians have understood that in the border area, you may have armored forces. And I think even the Russians have understood that, and even in Crimea, by the way, because it's not the first time. I mean, the attacks on Crimea are not new. This is not a new thing. It has happened since the beginning of the special military operations. So when the issue of using weapons, long-range weapons against in the depth of the Russian territory, this was considered as beyond this border area. And I think the Russians understood that. So it's not that they take the border as a strict limit. They understand that war is war, and that even if the theater of military operation, the TVD, as in the Russian terminology, the TVD Ukraine is not strictly confined by the political border. But obviously, it may extend a little bit over the border, and the Russians have understood that. But they consider that if you go deeper into the territory, then it makes no sense, because then you would attack mainly civilian objectives, and therefore there is no point having the. And that's why the Russians were upset when the Europeans, I mean the Brits, and then the Americans said that it's legitimate to use weapons in the depth of Russian territory. So that's something that the Russians were upset about. But again, they understand that you may have, and when you have, for instance, the combat in the Kharkov area, you have necessary some troops on the other side of the border. So it would be stupid from a Ukrainian perspective to wait that the Russians just cross the border to shoot at them. Of course, if you have indication that you have a tank battalion that is just over the border, even if it's in the Russian territory, they will attack that. And the Russians understand that. Now, the Russians understand that. But of course, the Russians will consider that if you attack military forces, okay, that's part of war. But when you start attacking civilians, then you are no longer in a war situation. And by the way, if you look at it from a Ukrainian perspective, and you can say, why would you start bombing a population that you want to liberate? Because since the beginning of the special military operations, the Ukrainians are promising that they would liberate Crimea, that they would expel the Russians and save the population from the Russian occupation. And now they are bombing this population. So you see, it doesn't make any sense.
Zelensky's government just mentioned, Zelensky's government is saying that these are civilian occupiers.
Yeah, well, yeah. So of course you can turn the thing in what the problem is that a civilian is a civilian, or from a humanitarian law perspective, these are civilians, period, and there is no good and bad civilians. They are civilians, and if you have some strategic thinking, then you will start saying, okay, these are civilians. We hope that the civilians will help us to get a read from the Russian military, and therefore we will spare the civilians, regardless of who they are, because you don't have their passport, so you cannot just have a missile that attacks the guys who have the right or the wrong passport. So that doesn't make any sense. But that indicates another thing. It indicates also that and by the way, this is the same thing we are witnessing in Palestine. that the US has absolutely no control over its allies. And and that's something that worries me a little bit, because you have on both sides, both on in Palestine as in Ukraine, you have a US providing weapons and saying, well, we provide weapons, but the Israelis on the side and the Ukrainians on the other side have promised that they will not use that against civilians and all that. And in both cases, we see that it's just not the case. And that, in fact, these allies of the US do whatever they want. They promise whatever in order to have the weapons, and then they do whatever they want. So the US has absolutely no control over these guys. And there is not even the respect between each other, because even the Israelis do not respect the Americans, obviously, and even the Ukrainians do not respect the Americans. They consider that the Americans are just here to provide weapons and provide support, period. And now then they have absolutely no say in the way the Ukrainians can use these weapons. That's the same on the Israeli side. And that's exactly, by the way, how you see these mass murders and war crimes committed with the benediction of European countries. Because at the same time, you have no European government protesting against that. And again, it shows that we have a very differential approach as to terrorism and attack on civilians. You know, all these attacks that have been documented, by the way, in Belgorod and all that, nobody raised that question. And you had this conference in Switzerland and all that. Nobody put that as a condition. And everybody knows that the Ukrainians are not specially respecting the international humanitarian law. And in that respect, it's interesting to see that you had recently an article in the New York Times that, in fact, explains that the Ukrainian government, or Zelensky government more precisely, doesn't abide by international law and human rights. So we know that even the media, and even the American media, and the New York Times is probably one of those mainstream media that have been so supportive for Ukraine. But when they say that Ukraine is not respecting the human rights or humanitarian law or whatever, no, not a single European government reacts to that. And that shows, in fact, that when we say we fight for values, democracy, and every kind of thing, in fact, it's not true. We fight for the values that we have decided applicable in this moment and in this place, period. But it's no, if those values, if we don't apply this value, this is not a problem. This is, do what I'm saying, don't do what I'm doing. In fact, this is exactly the problem. So we see that in that example that it shows really that the Ukrainians have become rogue in some way, and are not abiding by any rule, not even the rules, or the rules that they have decided with their main allies. And that shows, by the way, and again, also the reaction of the West show that the West has no longer any option. They see that they are losing the whole thing, and they have no possibility to, they have no way to change the situation. And therefore, they are, I would say, obliged to go into extreme solutions. It's in French, we use the word to flee forward. It's a it's a way of fleeing forward, because you are not able to find a solution. There's no strategy. We have discussed that already on your channel, that the West doesn't know what would mean a victory for Ukraine. Even Lord Austin, we have discussed that already, was not able to articulate any kind of strategy or any objective or any definition of what could be a victory for Ukraine. Meaning that from that point, when you have no strategy and nothing, you're just you're on the way of losing, in fact. And that's a dangerous moment, because when you feel that you are losing and that you have nothing to hold, then you start doing this kind of thing. And that's the kind of thing we may see happening more, probably, because that's the last resort to some extent. And that's worrisome in my view.
Yeah.
So that's what we can say with this attack. I think it's also interesting to see that this terrorist attack happened at the same time that you had also some terrorist attacks in Dagestan. You had two in Dagestan, but also two in Abkhazia, this is the Russian-speaking part of Georgia. And at the same time, by the way, so you have, in fact, 4 attacks. I mean, the attacks in Sebastopol, which were probably more than, there were 5 missiles, and then you have those 4 terrorist attacks in Abkhazia and in Dagestan. And that reminds me, I have mentioned a couple of times, I think, this study, not a study, it was more that it was the outline of a strategy that was made by the Rand Corporation in April 2019. And in this strategy, you have exactly what we have seen, which is described. Again, we have seen Sweden, Finland going to NATO. This was in a strategy. We have seen rearming Ukraine. This was in a strategy. We have seen the threat of attacking Transnistria and Moldavia. This was already in the strategy. We have seen, and we have seen already the confrontation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. This was in the strategy as well. And now we are witnessing terrorist attack in the Central Asia, which had already occurred in some way before. There was some issues last year in Kazakhstan, but here we have directly in Central Asia, the Central Asian part of Russia, you have direct attacks, and that was in the strategy as well. So all the items, and I would say even the chapters of this strategy outlined by the Rand Corporation, all that has been realized physically. And we see this scenario unfolding very precisely as it was described in this 300 pages document of the Rand Corporation. I really encourage everybody to read that document, because it shows exactly what we are witnessing since 2.5 years in Ukraine. And it even shows something that the analyst of the Rand Corporation wrote in the same study. They proposed that strategy to the Pentagon, because the Rand Corporation is a think tank of the Pentagon, so it was this strategy for the US government. But there is a special chapter devoted to the risks of this strategy, the risk involved by applying this strategy. And in that chapter, the Rand Corporation guys were equally precise as for the strategy itself, because they said, if you apply this strategy, you have to be aware that there is a risk of Ukraine losing, having huge losses in personnel. They will lose territory, and they will be pushed by Russia into a unfavorable peace. And that's exactly what we are witnessing. So it's of course more detailed in that. I'm just summarizing the idea. And it's interesting that in these risks, by the way, the analysts of the RAND Corporation caution the US government. They say, well, be careful, because because the sanctions and all that are also part of the strategy, of course. And they say, be careful, because our assessment of the Russian economy at this stage, and that was 2019, our assessment of the Russian economy is probably not accurate as it should. And probably the Russian economy is probably more resilient than what what we assumed in designing this strategy, meaning that the risk that the strategy fails is very big. And in fact, we are witnessing exactly that. We are witnessing exactly that. Even the caution of the RAND Corporation analysts are even can also be verified. So we see that the West has engaged into a strategy to use Ukraine with the purpose of weakening Russia. They didn't care about Ukraine whatsoever. They just wanted to weaken Russia. And despite the warnings that are contained in the original strategy, they did it. They underestimated the capabilities of the Russian economy. They underestimated the capabilities of the Russian military. They overestimated the resilience of European countries, and they overestimated equally the capabilities of the Ukrainian forces. And the result is a total failure. And that's exactly what I've written in my first book, Operation Z. That was written in the summer 2022, meaning that everything I'm saying now was identifiable in 2022. And since then, everything has been confirmed. So I'm very, coming from strategic intelligence background, and having worked with all strategic intelligence services in the West, I'm extremely disappointed by the capacities and the capabilities of the Western intelligence services, because what I could analyze 2 years ago, and at the very beginning of the special military operation, how come no single Western country has been able to make the same kind of analysis? Because everything what we're witnessing today and what we will witness in the coming months will simply confirm everything that I could identify 2 years ago. And that questions seriously the ability of our governments and our establishments more broadly to cope with crisis. And assuming that some countries want to engage China, I'm pretty sure that we are facing a big defeat, because we tend to overestimate our capabilities. We tend to overestimate or let's say our power. We used to have this power probably 100 years ago, and probably up to World War II. And after World War II, you had all these liberation movements and all that. Things started to change. But up to, let's say, the 60s or so, we could say that the West ruled the world, definitely. And to some extent, it still does. But the rest of the world understands now and has the capacity to counter the West. And the West is also, from many point of view, the West is destroying itself, meaning that you have two converging movements or developments. On the one hand, you have a southern hemisphere that is developing at high speed, with people who are better educated, with countries like China, India, that are in fact pushing the rest of the world by providing industrial support, but not only, also providing with the Belt and Road Initiative, providing infrastructure and all that. So you have a global South developing very quickly. And at the same time, you have what we call the Western Hemisphere, which is falling down, which is falling, falling and failing miserably. I mean, all the countries in Europe are in economic difficulties. The Western, the German Vice Chancellor, Mr. Habeck, went to China to beg China for help, because now Europe wants to put tariff on Chinese vehicles, and Habeck understands, because of course Germany is a big car producer, and they see that it's not coming well for Germany. So he goes to China to beg China, and explaining that no, it's not a punishment. We put tariff, but it's not a punishment. It's just a reaction. I mean, kind of strange argument to trying to force the Chinese to remove their tariff they want to put on Western products. This is kind of delusional approach based on this idea that the West used to be the world ruler, or the world ruler, whatever it was. I mean, the part of the world, and today this is gone, or this is in the process of going away. And this is not let's say a good let's say, I don't know, I don't find a word in English now, but it's not
gesture.
Not just a good gesture, but it's not a good how to say that, the if we anticipate that, we say it's not a good sign for the future. It's not a good sign for the future. And unfortunately, we're going there. But I'm going I drifted away from those missiles in Sebastopol. Yeah. But in fact, these missiles are the tip of the iceberg that shows that the West has nothing under control anymore. And we provide weapons, and it's what we provide to Ukraine, it's out of desperation and nothing else. There is no strategy connected to these weapons. There is no objectives connected to these weapons. We don't even know what the Ukrainians want to achieve with that. We just provide that to them because the purpose of these weapons, in fact, is just to have a longer war with Russia. And this again is a stupid strategy. And even Obama said that if you engage Russia, you're not going to win, because Russia has the escalation dominance. regardless of how you take the problem. And that's it. So meaning that if you engage, and that's the way, I mean, the Western countries try to go to engage Russia into a kind of attrition war, and the Russians are ready to address this question from an attrition war perspective. And we see, and we have seen that also when we discussed that with the new defense minister and all that. So we see that the Russians have understood that this is going to be a protracted war, and they are ready to engage that. The problem is that they have more resources than the West has. And we see today, we haven't addressed the question of Palestine or what's happening in Palestine, Hezbollah, and all that. But we had this, I think it was the Joint Chief of Staff, the U.S. Joint Chief of Staff, saying that basically U.S. would not be in a position to help Israel against a war in South Lebanon, against Hezbollah. So meaning that we see that, and remember that originally the military strategic orientation that, I mean, that was designed a few years ago, the US had decided that they could be able to wage two wars on two separate theaters. And we see that they are not even able to wage one war in Europe. Their capacities are already exhausted with Ukraine, and now they confess that they are not able to help Israel should or would Israel attack South Lebanon, meaning that they are not even able to not able to address one war on one theater, and they will not be able to address a second war on a second theater. And we see that in several countries now they are talking about reintroducing conscription, because they don't find professional soldiers anymore, because nobody is interested anymore in being soldiers. That was also a problem in U.S. forces, by the way. Whereas in Russia, they have exactly the opposite problem, because the fact that the Ukrainians, with the help of the West, attacks civilian population has reshuffled the national and the patriotic movements in Russia. So everybody now wants to join the armed forces and to participate in a war that, from their perspective, is a just war. Remember that the rationale for Russia to engage into the special military operation was to protect the population of Donbass. There was, of course, the issue of NATO and that in background, because the entering NATO was the rationale for Ukraine to attack the population, to provoke Russia, in fact. But from the Russian perspective, the purpose of the special military operation is to protect Russian-speaking individual population in Ukraine. So it's a just war from their point of view. And therefore, we have exactly, again, we have on the one hand exactly what I explained, that let's say global or more global point of view with the South, where you have more incentive to join BRICS and all that, and the West scrambling on the other hand. And you have exactly the same thing on the military side. The West is not able to and everybody understands that, because you have the different programs. If you look at the French election, the parliamentarian election that will take place next week and in a couple of weeks. I mean, they have two rounds of election, but one topic is to reestablish or to recreate a solid defense industry. because what they have left is no longer able to cope with a tense situation, or a situation in which France would be committed to war. So we see that the capacities are not there, the capabilities are not there. And on the Russian side, on the other hand, they prepare for that. And they prepare physically, but they're also prepared mentally to cope with the attrition or protracted war against the West. And everything we say in the West, you know, all these attempts to reject Russians. I mean, that you ban, for instance, Russian athletes from the Olympics, or at least you ban athletes competing under the Russian flag. They can compete under a neutral flag. But last year or 2 years ago, there was the Russian athletes were banned from the these Olympics for handicapped people, and they banned right away all the Russian athletes. They banned Russian from everywhere, and all that, which was totally unnecessary. I mean, including renaming paintings in the National Gallery in London. I had this famous painting of, I think it's Degas, of the the ballerinas. And originally the title of the painting was Russian Ballerinas. And the National Gallery renamed the painting into Ukrainian Ballerinas. So totally kind of stupid things that don't bring anything at strategic operational level, but just demonstrate Russophobia. And the Russian people in Russia, and not only in Russia, by the way, they are sensitive to that. They see that it's not just about helping Ukraine militarily. It's about destroying Russians, attacking Russians. As I said many times on the channel, I think also, is that I have to drink. Sorry. During the Cold War, we are fighting the Soviets, but we were not fighting Russians. We are not fighting individuals. We were fighting a system. We didn't want to become communists. We were fighting against a kind of Marxist-Leninist revolution or global revolution, whatever it was or wasn't. We will not discuss that here, but the point is that we are not fighting against individuals. We are fighting against an ideology, but we respected the individuals. Today, we see when we talk about Russians, we don't respect the individuals. We don't respect the human side of it. We just take everything in the same mixed bag and we put everything together. By the way, nobody knows exactly what is the ideology of Vladimir Putin. Once he's a Tsarist, once he's a communist, once he's an imperialist, once he's this, that. Nobody knows. We just invent adjectives to define Putin and to define what we assume is its ideology. And that's it. And from that point, since we don't know what we are fighting against, we're just fighting against the Russians. And that's exactly what makes the Russians so strongly supportive to their government. You know, instead of dividing Russia with all these measures, on the contrary, we are reinforcing the sentiment of a nation. We are reinforcing the sense with the Russians that they have to defend their country and all that. So we are reinforcing the Russians. So it's totally misguided, totally misguided.
It seems you talk about name calling Putin. I think it seems that it depends on who's criticizing Putin. If it's Republican in the United States, he prefers to call him a communist.
Yeah,
If
yeah,
it's a
exactly.
Democratic, call him imperialist. But the outcome is the same.
This is exactly that. We don't know. In fact, in reality, Putin could be considered by, let's say, European standard as a center-right figure, politically speaking. Meaning that he's a liberal, but a moderate liberal, meaning that he's in favor of free market, free enterprise, and all that, but still retaining an important role for the state in, for instance, in defense. And that's the reason why, by the way, Russia is able to have this military production to be developed so quickly, because the military industrial complex in Russia is not bound to profit. It's related to national interest, which is exactly the opposite of what we have done in Europe since the end of the Cold War, where in most countries, Switzerland, I mean, UK, Germany, Germany probably a little bit less, but France, you had the military industrial complex was strongly under the control of the government. And because essentially producing weapons, unless you sell them abroad, but even though it's not always, it cannot be a profitable activity. And in the US, it is privatized, not everything, by the way, but in a large part is privatized, and was even less privatized probably in the Cold War, but it's still the case. And the problem with the privatized military industry is that they need to have a profit in order to produce something. So if you say, for instance, to a company, well, you need to build a new production plant for artillery shells because we need them for the next 3 weeks, no company will do that, because they will say, well, this is not worth the investment. I mean, you ask me to invest hundreds of millions in a production plant that might or might not be used for the next weeks or next month. It's not worth it. So we are not going to do it. That's the reason why, by the way, the initiative that was launched by the Czech Prime Minister, Mr. Pavel, to provide Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells, this initiative just collapsed, because in the West, you have no company that will expand its production capacities and capabilities just for the sake of buying a few 100,000 shells and then it's over. You know, if you have a production plant, it has to last for years in order to provide a profit on the long term. If it's just an issue of a few months or so, nobody will it's not worth the investment. So but by contrast, if you go in Russia, then this is a matter of national security. It's not a matter of profit. So whether they produce 10,000 shells per month or 1 million per month, this is not a problem. I mean, this is just a matter of national interest. And it's exactly like firefighters. I mean, firefighters is not something you do for profit. You know, you invest into something in order to protect, and that's it. If you would privatize firefighters, you would probably face a failure, because if you assume there is no fire cases and so on, then your investment is for nothing. So, you know, and that applies to the medical sector and all that. And that explains why it's so expensive, for instance, in the US, as opposed to what you have in the West, for instance, for the same quality or even better quality in the West, in Europe, for instance. But because there are matters that are not profitable and should not be profitable because they are part of the service that the state provides to the population. Defense is one of these services. And that's exactly the view of the Russians. So in that sense, the Russians have a mixed approach to society. So it's a free market, a free society on the sense that it's free trade and all that. But at the same time, you have the part of this the state which is under the label of national security, for instance. This remains strongly under state control, and that makes a lot of sense in reality. And so Vladimir Putin has nothing to do with a communist. Is exactly the opposite of a communist. And he has said that from the very beginning, that the communist system was not a good one. And it was doomed to fail. And that's what happened. And Vladimir Putin explained that very explicitly. So, no, Vladimir Putin is not a communist. He's not even imperialist in the sense that the purpose of the intervention in Ukraine was not to gain territory. It was not to occupy Ukraine. That's the reason why in March 2022, when you had this draft agreement between Ukraine and Russia, Russia was ready to leave the country and to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, because the purpose is not the gaining territories. The same applies to in the West, in Europe, we come back. I mean, people come very often with the example of Georgia in 2008. It was exactly the same kind of scenario where Russia intervened in Georgia to protect the Russian-speaking population. This population was at the time under attack of the Georgian government. And that has been, in fact, confirmed by even a report that was provided to by the European Union. So the reason or the rationale for Russia to intervene in Georgia was not to occupy Georgia or to gain territory. It was to protect the Russian-speaking population. That's why the Baltic states are so afraid of Russia, because they know that they are not treating the Russian minority so well. You know, you may not know that in certain countries, I think it's Latvia and Estonia, the Russian minority is not considered as a citizen of the country. So they are non-citizens. And in fact, the thing is that during the Soviet time, you had, of course, Russians that were working in the Baltic state, for instance, and since the language, the official language was both Estonian and Russian. But basically, when you were working in administration and all that, basically Russian was fine. And a lot of people didn't even learn Estonian. As a result, when Estonia became independent, you had a lot of those Russian-speaking people who couldn't speak Estonian. But speaking Estonian was made as a condition to become citizen. So then the Estonians said, well, you don't speak Estonian, so you're not citizen. But they are still living in the country since generation. They were born there, and their parents were living there, and since World War II, basically they were there. So there was a status that was developed as a non-citizen. And in fact, some Russian people of the Russian minorities in those countries, I mean, Latvia and Estonia, cannot have a passport in those countries. So they need to have, they have a European passport, a passport of the European community, European Union. They don't have an Estonian passport. So you see that even in Western Europe, in the European Union, you have a situation where countries do even have non-citizens, which is, what kind of values are we defending? You know, what kind of values? And now, if you look at this from a Russian perspective, you say, who are those Estonians? Well, of course, they commemorate the Third Reich, and all these countries had units in the Waffen-SS during World War II, and they're still commemorating these soldiers who used to fight for the Third Reich. The same as you have in Ukraine, by the way. So of course, then that explains also why Latvia and Estonia are so afraid of Russia, because they know, they have seen what happened in Georgia and in Ukraine, because in both countries the issue was an issue of respecting the rights of those populations, and they know they are not doing properly against those minorities in their own countries. But instead of learning the lesson and saying, okay, we have seen what happened in Georgia and then in Ukraine, so we will arrange a status for this Russian minority. No, that's not what they are doing. On the contrary, they are even putting more pressure on their Russian minorities and removing all the monuments that were commemorating the sacrifice of Soviet soldiers in World War II. They are exerting even more pressure on these populations. So sometimes you can ask yourself, who are those guys? They don't, to me, from an intellectual and cultural perspective, European cultural perspective, these guys do not belong to Europe. They're not Europeans. They represent nothing of the values that we hoped, I mean, the values we used to fight for during the Cold War. I mean, I'm a Cold Warrior. And the reason why we're fighting against the communist system is precisely because we thought that all nations could have their own specificities and the freedom to speak languages and all that. And okay, now what you see in Latvia and Estonia is exactly the opposite. To me, they represent absolutely nothing of the European values, zero. They represent just the values of the European nation they used to help during World War II. That's all.
Yeah. When you look at the reaction coming from Russia after these attacks, these two terrorist attacks, you call it the third attack in Georgia as well. And how do you see, because we know right after this, the United States ambassador Lynn Tracy in Moscow was summoned to the Russian foreign ministry. And in Russia, they're talking about that Washington bears equal responsibility with the Kiev regime for the atrocity that is happening. And they're talking about they're gonna punish the United States. And in your opinion, what they're talking about when they're saying that they're gonna punish the United States, where they can do this? Is that with Houthis? Is that somewhere else? What's available for Russians?
Well, first of all, we have to see we have to consider different aspects. We have talked about what happened in Sebastopol and what happened in Dagestan in the Central Asian area. So on the terrorist attacks that happened in Dagestan and all that, to me, it's probably, I wouldn't be surprised if you would find some CIA or MI6 activities behind this. I don't know. We have no evidence at this stage, but I wouldn't be surprised because this happened at a very convenient time. And as I said, this was part of the strategy to weaken Russia. As we speak of Sevastopol, I would not say, I mean, I have no indication, I have not more indication that anybody on that, but I would rather say that for the case of Sebastopol is more a matter of Ukraine going rogue than something planned, organized, and supported by the US. And even though some mentioned that there was RQ-4B Global Hawk long-range, long-endurance drone circling in above the Black Sea at that time, I wouldn't say, I mean, again, I have no solid indication, but I would suggest that the this Global Hawk vehicle was surveilling the theater of operations in Ukraine at large, but was probably not used to guide the missiles. You know, those missiles, they can be programmed with kind of, let's say, GPS or so. You give the coordinate and you attack a beach is something that doesn't move. So you attack a beach, period. And if there are 10 people, there are 10 people. If there are hundreds, there are hundreds. You just attack the beach. You don't need to have special guidance and special intelligence to do that. The purpose of the Global Hawk and this kind of devices or equipment is to target on forces that are mobile. Let's say the Kharkov area, for instance, when you have units moving around on the battlefield, then you need to track them, to identify them, and then this kind of information is useful for the missile you use, because then it can provide timely and updated information about the targets, and that's the purpose of this equipment. And I would suggest that these Global Hawk UAVs were directed at this part of the TVD Ukraine. But to target the beach, you don't need that. So my personal view, again, the Russians might have different understanding, different views, different data, and maybe I'm wrong. But I would suggest that to do this kind of attack, you don't need to have the Americans to do it. And by the way, I'm not sure the Americans would like to do that. The Americans, in the case of Ukraine, we have discussed that already. They don't want to escalate the conflict. They don't want the conflict to take another dimension for various reasons. First of all, they don't want to have a real escalation where you have an escalation in the use of weaponry and things like that. So they want, ideally for the Biden administration, and especially because of the presidential election, they would like to keep this conflict at a very low profile level, the lowest profile. They know it's lost. They know they will not be able to have any measurable success in Ukraine. So they will continue because they want to weaken Russia. The objective is still there, but they don't want to do it in a way that force other countries to engage in the war or to be committed, and therefore they would make every effort to keep the conflict at the level where it is and not more than this. Longer in the time, I mean, to protracting the conflict, but not intensifying the conflict. That's my personal view. So that's the first thing. And second, of course, you know, they have the experience now in Palestine, supporting a party that is openly violating human rights and international humanitarian law is not a good idea. And that's exactly what Biden is experiencing now at home, with all the protests against him, people leaving the Democratic Party, and people saying that they want anyone as president, but no longer Biden. So the fact that Biden supported so openly Netanyahu in the first part of the first phase of the conflict, I mean last year especially, and didn't put any limits to the help he would provide to Netanyahu, was extremely negative for the image of the Democrats at large and for Biden in particular. So they know that supporting a party that doesn't behave properly is not a good idea. And that's the reason why the Americans, if they know that the Ukrainians are openly violating international conventions and all that, they are not, I think they will probably do nothing against Ukrainians, but they don't want to be associated with that. And as a result, again, maybe the information and the intelligence the Russians have may indicate something else. But my personal view is that the Americans were not involved in the issue in Sebastopol. So that's my personal understanding based on the assessment of the different parties. I may be wrong, but I think it's I'm probably right on this. On the other hand, supporting terrorist activities covertly with clandestine activities, CIA, MI6 things and all that, in Dagestan, try to resurrect the Islamist insurgency there. That might something that is possible, because after all, the Americans are still using the Islamic State and other Islamist group in Syria against Bashar al-Assad. And we know that even in the Idlib area in Syria, you have all these Islamists that have regrouped in kind of a protected zone, which is protected by Turkey, by the way. And these guys are used, and some of them, in fact, ended up on the Ukrainian operation theater on the Ukrainian side. So, and these guys were probably also those we mentioned briefly before, the Crocus terrorist attack in February, or when was it, in April or so. And we know that some of these guys were from that part of Syria. I mean, they used to be host or guests, better said, they were guests in this part of Syria. So it might well be that you may have some clandestine operation that use those extremists in order to stimulate a kind of insurgents and insurgency movements in the Caucasus. So we may have that. So there again, the Russians will probably come up with a lot of intelligence in the coming months, but I wouldn't be surprised if we would see the hidden hand of UK or US behind these attacks. But that's probably not the case in Sebastopol. Even if to use those attacks, you still have US advisors to help the handling of those systems, because the ATACMS missile use the same launcher as the HIMARS launcher. So it's the same launcher. You have a kind of a modular like cartridges, if you want, with several missiles. I mean, the HIMARS missile, or you have bigger cartridge with the ATACMS, and you can load whatever cartridge you want on the launcher. So to summarize a little bit, and you may have, of course, foreign advisors to help the handling, because I'm not sure the Ukrainians have enough trained people to handle these weapons. So you may have training, but whether they are involved in targeting, I have no idea. It might be, but I'm not sure. And we have seen in the past that, in fact, the Ukrainians do not share much with the US. And that was made obvious last year. You may remember in the early 2023, that was in April or so, as the these leaked documents, these Pentagon documents were leaked with all the data on the preparation of the counteroffensive. And we had all these intelligence assessment of the Russians' capabilities, of the Ukrainians, and so on. And on that occasion, it was apparent that the Ukrainians didn't share much information with the US. And interestingly enough, despite all the assets that the US has on the ground and in the air, they were not able to let's say, to assess the total strengths and the capabilities of the Ukrainians, meaning that Ukrainians are very keen to receive weapons, but they're probably not so keen to share information with their Western allies. So that's you may have here and there some US, German, Polish advisors and all that, but I'm not sure they have access to everything. They might be used for specific operations or specific activities, and to have a very limited scope of activities, but they may not be aware of everything, especially when it comes to planning, targeting, and this kind of thing. The Ukrainians, as I understand it, are very protective, and even with the Western allies, they don't share much. So that probably help to respond to your question, but we don't know for sure. This is just an assessment based on my experience. And I remember when I was in Ukraine, because I was there in the framework of NATO to help to rebuild the Ukrainian armed forces in 2014, as these armed forces were, in fact, a lot of people were defecting to the rebels. All the Russian speakers were defecting. So you had the whole structure of the Ukrainian forces that were crumbling, because you had complete regiment, including weapons, ammunition, and all the gear, everything, ammunition, everything. They were going to the rebels. So that had a considerable impact on the structure of the armed forces, but it had also a considerable impact on the morale and the ability of the Ukrainian forces to operate, as simple as that. So, and I could see at that time that even if the Ukrainians were very happy to see NATO coming for help and all that, I could feel that they didn't share much with us. They didn't really trust us. They have a limited trust. They have probably more trust than the Russians. That's probably understandable. But at the same time, they didn't trust totally their allies, and that's obvious even today. So that's why I don't think that at the Sebastopol attack, as an example, I don't think it was done with the blessing of the US. You may remember, by the way, that some attacks that were performed against Belgorod, those raids with these Russian nationalists, ultra-nationalists that serve under the Ukrainian flag, but they used to make those raids against Belgorod. Even these kind of attacks were in fact not welcomed by the Americans, and they were not even informed that these attacks occurred. So I think, of course, we are at war, and Russia is at war with US in some way, and it's for obvious reason. They say US is responsible. To some extent, it's probably true. But when we go down to the nitty-gritty, I would say probably the US is probably not involved in everything of this kind of operation. And probably even they would not agree with that.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Just to wrap up this session, you talk about Israel and what's going on right now in that region. We know that the United States was talking about that we're going to help Israelis, whatever it takes. We're going to use everything available. And right after that, they said that if they start fighting Hezbollah, they're not going to be there. They're not going to help them. And because we had the reaction from Afghanistan, from these groups, they said, if something happens, we're going to go there. We're going to fight with United States, with whatever going to be there. And do you think at the end of the day, Netanyahu, this would bring the new declaration, this new policy of the Biden administration would bring Netanyahu to some sort of sanity, or he's going to double down?
It's very hard to talk because we are no longer in a kind of rational thinking there. We recently, the IDF spokesman just said that Hamas cannot be defeated. But remember that since the 7th of October, the narrative was we will defeat Hamas, we'll destroy Hamas. Hamas will not exist anymore, we'll destroy the command structure, we'll destroy everything, blah, blah, blah. And 9 months after that, they realized that it's not doable. So, and if you read my book, the Al-Aqsa flood, that is behind me on that side.
Yeah.
I said that already, and the book was finished early this year. But based on everything we could know at that time on Hamas and the capabilities of the IDF, it was clear to me that they would not be able to win or to defeat Hamas. And that was confirmed by the IDF spokesman a couple of days ago. So meaning that we are not in a rational type of thinking. We are, again, it's very similar to Ukraine to some extent. And these are the same people, by the way. The same origin. Remember that Netanyahu is a Ukrainian. No, he's a Polish. He's a Pole originally. He's Pole. But most of the people in Israel come from this area of Poland and Ukraine. That's something that people don't realize. Probably 90% of the population of Israel comes from that part of the world. So they're the same people, and and they think the same, and they think ideologically, and they think in a kind of a egocentric way. They think that what they are the center of everything, and they are right on everything, and they have a hard time to take into account the view of others and to take also the realities on the ground into account. And you have, if you look at Zelensky or Netanyahu, there are a lot of similarities in the way they behave. And it becomes to be extremely erratic and irrational. That's why it's very difficult to assess how Netanyahu will act in the future. I mean, if you had a rational assessment of the situation in October, you would not have attacked Gaza as the Israeli did, because it was clear, and that's something I wrote in my book, by the way. It was clear from the very beginning that attacking so massively the Palestinian population would create a strategic problem for Israel, and that's exactly what's coming. I mean, now you have even Saudi Arabia that used to be ready to engage into the Abraham agreement with Israel. Now they say, well, we are ready to engage in such an agreement, but we need to include the Palestinian question, which previously was excluded from the agreement, meaning that the strategic posture of Israel has been weakened massively. And you see that everywhere. The word anti-Semitism doesn't scare anybody, because at the end, some say, I mean, being anti-Semitic means that you try to save the life of Palestinians. That's the meaning of anti-Semitic today. And therefore, we see that the whole perception we had of Israel a few months ago, I mean, 1 year ago, has been totally reversed. And you can see that a lot of people who used to be, even Israeli, by the way, who used to be against Hamas, now they say, well, maybe Hamas is right. So the way Israel handled the problem was, from a strategic point of view, exactly the opposite of what they should have done. Exactly the opposite. And based on that, it's hard to assess what they will do for South Lebanon and Hezbollah, because they are also like in Ukraine. They're in a condition of desperation. They may need to do something to achieve a success. I mean, Gaza was absolutely no success. They lost their honor for nothing. When you start to practice torture, mistreatment against prisoners and all that, and that was even demonstrated by the condition of the prisoners that were liberated from the Israeli forces in Nuseirat about 10 days ago. And you find those 4 prisoners were in good health. They were a little bit fatter than before. They were obviously well treated, respectfully treated, and so on. while at the same time we could see the way the Israeli treated the Palestinians. And that, just that, is enough to understand what kind of regime is Israel. What kind of regime is that? You know? And so the problem here is that having no success at all, having lost the respect, the honor, the consideration of the rest of the world, they might be tempted to have kind of a, you know, this last battle where you fight desperately and all that. You may have this kind of thing, you know, and I don't know what is in the mind of Netanyahu. I think now the military, the Israeli military, because the military, even if they are also ideologically motivated, definitely, but at least they see the reality on the ground, and they see that they lose fighting vehicles, soldiers, dead, wounded, and all these guys who have done post-traumatic disorders and all that. And apparently this is a serious problem in Israel, because Israel has a society as we have in the West. That means youngsters who are not ready to be engaged in the harsh fighting where you have death at each corner, and where you are under permanent stress and all that. They're not ready for that. As a result, after a few days, they are completely psychologically destroyed. And so you have this kind of individuals, so meaning that the military understands what it would cost to go in South Lebanon. Remember that in 2006, even if the IDF caused massive destruction in the south, in Lebanon and all that, they didn't defeat Hezbollah. In fact, Hezbollah defeated the IDF, despite all the destructions made by Israel. So the amount of destruction is not a measure of success. And the Israelis start to understand that. And Gaza demonstrates that blatantly. They have destroyed everything. They have killed so many civilians and children, 3 times more civilians than both the Russians and the Ukrainians in 2.5 years of war in Ukraine. So in 9 months, just the Israeli did 3 times more or better or worse than the both Ukrainian and the Russian together in 2.5 years. So does the amount of destruction measure your success? No. The amount of destruction measures your defeat. That's exactly the essence of asymmetric warfare, by the way. So that's basically what you do, just backfires on you. And that's exactly the problem. So the Israeli military understands that. They were defeated in 2006. The army is probably not better today, and probably even worse, because we are now on the 24th, and 6 days ago, the Hezbollah published a video of it's a 9 minutes 21 seconds video. It's a propaganda video, obviously, but this video showed a Hezbollah drone that moved around in all the northern part of Israel and pinpointing possible targets in Israel. And the interesting thing is that in the video you had also some excerpt of a video made by suicide drones, by the way. targeting Iron Dome installation. And the old video shows that these drones could move around in the northern part of Israel without being destroyed. Meaning that this widely acclaimed Iron Dome and all that everybody wants to buy in Europe and all that just failed. Just failed. And with a 9 minutes video, the Hezbollah showed the weakness of the Israelis by pointing. Even they even flew over the Haifa, the port of Haifa, which is a military port with sensitive installations there, and that was a source of concern of the Israeli military. So you have this Israeli state that is based on extensive security, that has developed this so-called know-how in developed security systems and all that. They advertise that in the whole world. But in reality, it's not working. We have seen that as the Iranians responded to the attack against the Damascus consulate, the Iranian consulate in Damascus. And they demonstrated that, in fact, the Iranian, if they want, they can pass all the barriers that were made by Israel through the various layers of anti-missile defense and all that. So, and now the Hezbollah, with means which are probably less powerful than Iran also, even with their own capacities, they were able to fly over the whole northern part of Israel without being destroyed. So it shows that Israel is probably too self-centered, and this kind of egocentrical view that I explained also about the West, generally speaking, that we think that because we ruled the world for centuries, we are invincible and everything we say is right. This starts to, I mean, the Hezbollah and others demonstrate that it starts to be wrong. I mean, and that's exactly what we're witnessing. And for that reason, I think the military in Israel is probably more cautious than the political leadership in engaging the Hezbollah. And if the Americans are trying to pressure or to put some pressure on the Israeli government to avoid a war, they will probably not, they would turn a blind eye if the Israeli would send a few missiles over Lebanon and this kind of things. But they probably would avoid, they would pressure Israel to avoid to engaging something more serious with Hezbollah. And my personal view is that if Israel tries to do so, it might be the start of the end for Israel, I think. Probably not militarily, but politically. Because today you have some countries like Egypt, Jordan, who kept a very neutral stance during the conflict. I mean, they were obviously most in favor of Palestinians, but they didn't show it. They tried to have a kind of balanced approach to the issue. But if there is a hard confrontation with Lebanon, and you have hundreds, if not thousands, of volunteers coming from Iran, from Afghanistan, and elsewhere coming there, then we may have another situation, and the West, I'm not sure the West would, then you have this other aspect that I have already mentioned. Let's assume Israel is attacked, or let's say it attacks Hezbollah and then it doesn't win. Who wants to help a country that is under a court or trial for genocide? Who wants to help an army that is responsible for so many war crimes? Who wants to support a state that has consistently violated international law since its creation? All these aspects come to the surface now. So far, we considered Israel as the only democracy of the Middle East and all that, and you had all these myths that were propagated, and most of the people didn't pay much attention, and they agreed with the idea. But today, who will still say or confirm that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East? I don't know if other countries in the Middle East are democracies. This is a subject to discussion, by the way. But whether Israel is so different, it is probably different in the sense that it's more westernized. But does it mean is more respectable? Does it mean that it is more respectful of international law? Obviously not. So what this conflict has shown is that probably our view or interpretation or perception of Israel in the last 75 years was probably not as right as it should. And probably we should have raised this issue of respect of the international law earlier. Had we done that already in the late 40s, early 50s, probably we wouldn't have this situation today. But the West turned a blind eye because at the time it was a question of the Cold War, and all the countries around Israel were more or less affiliated or connected to the Warsaw Pact, or let's say the Eastern Europe. And Israel was, in fact, at that time, the only Western or piece of West in the Middle East. As a result, we turned a blind eye over everything they did because it was our asset in the Middle East. But since the end of the Cold War, this doesn't apply anymore. I mean, all these countries, the countries surrounding Israel, have shown that they are probably closer to the West than they were supposed to be. You have even countries like Jordan, for instance, who is in a partnership with NATO, for instance, and most of the Maghreb countries, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, are also part of the so-called Mediterranean Dialogue, which is a partnership with NATO, with Israel, by the way. Israel is also part of this partnership. So today we see that the configuration of the Middle East has changed, drastically changed. Even Syria has made every effort to get closer to the West, has worked with Western intelligence to fight terrorism and all that. But since the Israeli wanted Syria to be dismantled, to be Balkanized, then this rapprochement never occurred completely. So that's a pity for Syria, but That's the way it is. But what I mean with that is that today the situation has drastically changed. I would say we don't need Israel anymore, if I can put it that way. We needed it in the Cold War because, again, it was like the advanced position in the Middle East. But today it's no longer the case. So we could have other allies in the Middle East. So the situation has changed, and Israel should well be we would be well advised to see that the international geopolitical and geostrategic situation has changed, and basically beyond the various lobbies we have in European Union and US to help the Israeli lobby and this kind of thing. Beyond this, we don't need to have Israel in the Middle East anymore. And so that's a reality, and probably that becomes even a more dramatic reality for Israel as it is considered as a genocidal state and all this. We are not so far because the International Court of Justice has not made its decisions as far as I know so far. But we might have in a situation, at least a lot of people consider that Israel is a genocidal state, which is, in my view, a problem when you start to help Israel. I mean, now you see the discussion with providing weapons to Israel. And that's the discussion you have in the UK, you have in Germany, you have in France, you have in the US. People say, why should we provide weapons to a genocidal state? Even if it does not be decided it is a genocidal state, so at this stage, but still people ask the question, meaning that why would we die for a country that is performing genocide? Why would we die for a country which everybody hates because of its behavior? And this behavior has been demonstrated. You see, that's really an open question. And again, I say Israel should be well advised to think about this, because the support it enjoyed during the last 75 years or so might not be the same in the future.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure. We talk about Ukraine, Israel. I think we've covered a lot of areas that were of importance and are of importance right now.
Well, I think, yes. The interesting thing is that we have this kind of discussion in channels like yours, which remain kind of alternative to some extent. But this kind of discussion doesn't occur in the mainstream media, for instance, and in our political establishment. For instance, where I live even Belgium probably is a little bit better than France or Switzerland or UK or so. But we see in these countries there's absolutely no discussion. I mean, any discussion is banned, simply. And my concern is that by banning the discussion, we cannot measure what is at stake for Israel and for the others as well. But we understand better what is at stake for the Palestinians. But we tend to ignore that there is also a lot at stake for Israel as well. If they don't want to discuss, after all, that's their problem. But I'm not sure they will benefit from that. I think in the mid and long run, they will suffer from the absence of discussion. And you see that already. I think you see anti-Semitism skyrocketing in the West. And it's interesting because if you look at, for instance, France as an example, they say, well, anti-Semitism is increasing because of what the Hamas does. And I'm not sure it's that. In fact, if you analyze carefully what people say and how people react and the behavior, anti-Semitic behavior, you would see that the problem is it's not because the Hamas does this or not. The problem is that Israel does things that are never punished. There's no sanction for that. And that is, I think, injustice is the driver for anti-Semitism. This is the driver. It's not even whether, I think in Europe at least, nobody cares about someone if he's Jew and that. They hate Muslims because they are terrorists. And then they say, oh, well, all the Muslims are terrorists. And that's the kind of thing. Okay, that's one thing. If we could discriminate between those who are terrorists and those who are simple, normal, honest Muslim, the problem will be solved. But okay, this is one problem. About the Jews, it's something different. Is this people tend to assimilate? They say, well, the problem is that the Jews can allow themselves whatever they want. They can kill people and nobody says anything. And this is this double standard that generates anti-Semitism. If Israel would be more criticized and openly criticized and put into discussion honestly, without, I'm not suggesting that we should be aggressive against Israel. It's absolutely not what I'm suggesting, but have a honest discussion and trying to understand what's going on and all that. And if there is a blame to be delivered to Israel, then we deliver the blame. But we don't want to do that. So we turn everything around and we say, well, there is nothing to do. If Israel, you see all these massacres and everything that has been done, including, by the way, you have people in France, they said, well, you know, the value of a Palestinian baby is not the same as an Israeli baby, because on the 7th of October, Palestinians deliberately attacked Israelis. And while the Palestinians who are killed is just because we use a bomb and by chance we killed a baby. So it is not the same value. That's kind of absurd type of mentality. And that, that creates anti-Semitism. Because when you start to have this kind of discriminatory approach to death, especially when it comes to children, nobody can stand that. Nobody can stand that. And the automatic reaction to that is that these guys are absolutely ruthless and they don't deserve our respect. That's exactly the consequence. And unfortunately, since we tend to, and also in the political discussion, by the way, when we talk about Zionism and Judaism, people tend to say when you criticize Zionism, it's anti-Semitic. While for me, what is Judaism? It's a matter of religion and culture, or it's related to a people, generally speaking. While Zionism is an ideology, it's a political ideology. By the way, you even have Christian Zionists, meaning that it's something that goes beyond Judaism and all that. But the narrative in the West, they tend to aggregate those two notions into one. As a result, a lot of people would like to criticize the Zionist regime in Israel, but they are not necessarily against the Jews, but they are equally treated as anti-Semitic. As a result, in fact, to some extent, you could say that the Zionists are using the Jews as human shield to some extent. And that's the problem, because since we tend to create that confusion, then the confusion comes in the spirit in the mind of the people. And they say, well, you are Jews, then you are pro-Zionists. Zionism is Judaism. So Jews are Zionists, and Zionists are whatever you may define them, but probably not good things. And that generates the anti-Semitism. And it's interesting to see, and again, here I speak about what I'm observing in Belgium and in France. And it's probably the same in the US, by the way. But in France, it's almost a caricature. By mixing the two, well, people, well, they confuse automatically. And that's the reason why they don't care whether it's a Zionist or not. You are a Jew, that's the same thing, period. And the Jewish organizations, or better, the Zionist organizations, or Zionist organizations that are considered as Jewish organizations, they have not realized this. They don't try to make a distinction between the two. On the contrary, because they feel that using the word anti-Semitism is a way of protecting themselves. But the problem is that it's just increasing the problem to them. And it's interesting, they haven't understood that. They haven't understood that mechanism. And as a result, you will have an increase in anti-Semitism in the future. And that's very unfortunate. That's very unfortunate. And I don't understand how come people cannot understand that. It's beyond my understanding. But again, we are probably working with people who are ideologically so motivated that probably they cannot see anything else than what they think.
Yeah.